Welcome to the FW de Klerk Foundation's Constitution at Work podcast. I'm Daniela Ellerbeck, an attorney and the Constitutional Rights Program Manager at the FW de Klerk Foundation. Joining me today are the FW de Klerk Foundation's Constitutional Advancement Program Manager, Ismail Joosub.
Hi, everybody.
And Ismail's new intern at the Constitutional Advancement Program, Thando Malinga.
It's lovely to be here.
Today we are privileged to have very esteemed guest, Adv Paul Hoffman, who's a senior counsel, a distinguished advocate with an illustrious career marked by his fight against corruption.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Paul Hoffman, one of the directors of Accountability Now, a small but noisy NGO that is involved in exacting accountability and promoting responsiveness to needs of ordinary people.
And Adv Glynnis Breytenbach, a former prosecutor of the National Prosecuting Authority and a current Member of Parliament for the DA.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Glynnis Breytenbach. I am a Member of Parliament for the Democratic Alliance. My portfolio is the Justice and Constitutional Development portfolio, amongst others.
Fantastic. So everyone, today we're going to be talking about, and you guessed it, corruption. So Advocate Paul Hoffman, perhaps let's start with you. The Constitutional Court has said that corruption is a constitutional and human rights issue. And we all know that the Constitution is the supreme law of South Africa and that any act or failure to act that is in contradiction with it is unlawful. And that the state has a constitutional duty to take all reasonable measures to create an independent body to combat corruption and organized crime. Can you tell us a bit more about this?
Yes, this flows from the order and the reasoning in the case that is now commonly called Glenister 2. Mr. Glenister is a Johannesburg businessman who went to the Constitutional Court 3 times because he was very unhappy that the Scorpions were being closed down after an urgent resolution was taken at the Polokwane conference of the ANC in 2007. Now, the first time he got to the Constitutional Court in 2008, he was told that his case was premature, that Parliament should be given an opportunity of introducing amendments for the replacement of the Scorpions in the Criminal Justice Administration, and that if he wasn't happy, he should come back for another bite to assail the constitutionality of whatever Parliament put in place of the Scorpions. And so it came to pass that the Scorpions were closed down after a big fight in which everybody except the ANC wanted to retain the Scorpions, but they had the majority in Parliament, and all you needed to close the Scorpions was a simple majority in Parliament. So Glenister 2 was then started in the High Court in Cape Town and found its way to the Constitutional Court by way of appeal. And in that appeal, the majority judgment of the Constitutional Court said that the Constitution of South Africa really means, although it doesn't say so, that a body outside executive control is required in order to deal effectively with corruption. And in that case, an order was made which was to the effect that Parliament was given 18 months to pass remedial legislation in order to give the anti-corruption body that was replacing the Scorpions. It was then called the Hawks, but and in fact the name Hawks is stuck, even though the current incarnation of the Hawks is nothing like the first incarnation. But the idea was that an adequately independent body should replace the reform that had been introduced after the Scorpions were closed down. And so exactly 18 months later, Parliament passed legislation which gave us a new incarnation of the Hawks. And immediately, the Helen Suzman Foundation, which had been a friend of the court in Glenister 2, got stuck in, and so did Mr. Glenister, challenging the constitutionality of the revised version of the Hawks. And we are still in the position today that the finding in Glenister 2 that a body outside executive control is what is needed to deal with corruption. We're still in the position today that no such body has ever been formed. We've had the ID, and then IDAC, Investigating Directorate, and then when it was turned into a legislative body, the Investigating Directorate Against Corruption. But both of these are bodies within the National Prosecuting Authority, and the National Prosecuting Authority is run as a program within the Department of Justice. It is under the final responsibility of the Minister of Justice. Its accounting officer is the Director General of Justice, and it has policies that have to be concurred in by the Minister. So quite clearly, it is not a body outside executive control, and that is why corruption continues to run rampant in South Africa, despite the efforts of Mr. Glynnis. Fortunately, the Democratic Alliance has before Parliament at the moment a pair of bills that are designed to establish and enable an anti-corruption commission under Chapter 9 of the Constitution. If the Scorpions had been a Chapter 9 institution, we would not have the problem that we have today, because it would not have been possible in the face of so much opposition in Parliament to close them down with anything less than a 2/3 majority. That is one of the characteristics of the anti-corruption machinery of state. It should be secure in its tenure of office. In fact, the court in Glynnis 2 said specialists who are trained in anti-corruption work and operate and are structured in an independent way, have guaranteed resources and secure tenure of office is what is required. And we will get that if the DA's bills currently pending in Parliament are passed. If we don't, if those bills are rejected, then the next step in the process is to go back to court and seek declaratory, mandatory, and supervisory relief. So the declaration of rights will be that what we have is not compliant with what is required in binding terms by the ruling in Glynnis 2. The mandatory relief will be to order Parliament to put in place legislation that fixes that problem. And the supervisory part of the relief is for the court to keep a watchful eye over what Parliament does in order to remediate the situation.
Fantastic. So instead of doing a Glynnis 4, for example, if Mr. Glynnis would still be involved, challenging the tweaking of the legislation, lessening the Minister of Police's control over the Hawks version 3, the DA has brought a pair of bills, as you have said.
Correct. And while those are pending before Parliament, the judiciary will defer to Parliament's decision on those bills, which means that the litigation process is currently in limbo, pending the outcome of what the other branches of government have to say.
Thando, Ismail, any questions for Advocate Hoffman before we move on to Honourable Breytenbach?
May I just jump in with a question for Advocate Hoffman? You know, Advocate Hoffman, my question to you requires an opinion from you. Now, ideally, we'd like our anti-corruption machinery in South Africa to be completely insulated from political interference. But in your opinion, do you think that the Hawks have been purposely politically starved of resources so as to enable them not to do their work efficiently?
Yes, look, as soon as you put the investigation of corruption in the hands of a body that answers to a cabinet minister, you're on a hiding to nothing. The Hawks have in fact been under-resourced throughout. Their vacancy rate is around 50%. Half of the positions in the Hawks are empty. One of the reasons for that is quite interesting. There's a body called the Special Investigations Unit, which is not part of the Criminal Justice Administration of South Africa at all. It used to be called the Heath Commission until it was worked out that putting a judge in charge of a body that's in the executive isn't such a good idea. And so it transmogrified into the Special Investigations Unit. And that unit is not being outside the Criminal Justice Administration, is not subject to the budgetary constraints that the police and the prosecution service have. Everybody there gets paid much better than those who are in the police and the prosecution service. And so all the best people have been recruited by the Special Investigation Unit, which works to the civil standard of proof. it needs to show on a balance of probabilities that there's been an irregularity or corruption in a procurement or whatever it is that the president in his discretion has signed a proclamation for, and they then spend their time raking back the loot and referring matters that are particularly egregious to the prosecution service for prosecution. And then the process of investigation starts again to the beyond reasonable doubt standard of proof that is required if you want to have a conviction of corruption.
I think all of the puzzle pieces are starting to fit together now to see how our anti-corruption machinery fits together and what role each of these mechanisms play. But Advocate Hoffman, something that we heard about in the media a lot recently that many South Africans hadn't heard of before is something called this National Anti-Corruption Advisory Council. It's where our new acting Minister of Police, Firoz Kachalia, comes from. I'll confess, I've never heard about it before 2 months ago. What is this? How are such councils created? How are the members of such councils appointed? What's their role? And do their recommendations hold any water at the end?
I'm very pleased to tell you that at the end of that advisory council, which was called into being in August 22 by President Ramaphosa, its life will end on the 29th of August 2025. That body was called into existence in order to advise Cabinet on the anti-corruption machinery of state. And immediately it was appointed, I made a lot of noise about, well, all it needs to do is tell government to implement Glynnis 2. And I would venture to guess that they are all there looking for ways around the Glynnis judgment.
Advocate Hoffman, I understand what you're saying, especially with the recent police commissioner, the Mkhwanazi case that had come out. I think South Africans were really shocked to know that that's what's happening in the police force. But I think it really ties into what you're saying in terms of the political engagement within these constitutional and prosecution commissions does not help. But do you think that there will ever be a space where, for example, the NPA or the Hawks are independent from the political, I guess, meddling that is happening?
That is why I'm advocating and supporting the bills, which will create a separate anti-corruption body that will deal with serious cases of corruption. Recovering the hot money will be the national sport when the Breytenbach bills are made law.
So, Advocate Breytenbach, you recently introduced a private member's bill entitled the Constitutional 21st Amendment Bill to create this independent body. And Advocate Hoffman also referred to a pair of bills. Can you tell us a bit more about this?
The bill that describes the independent body to be introduced and the meat of that bill, which Advocate Hoffman has mostly dealt with already and derives from really the Glynnis 2 judgment. The bills have been introduced to Parliament. They have served before the Justice Portfolio Committee. The 21st Amendment Bill, as you said, sets up the Chapter 9 institution that is envisaged as an institution that will be styled the Anti-Corruption Commission and will consist of a combination of skills, prosecutorial skills and capabilities and authority, investigative skills, competencies and authority, and then, as importantly, forensic skills, which are sorely needed, cannot possibly do a corruption case of any magnitude without access to forensic skills. And at the moment, in the existing structures, so in the existing structures being the Hawks and the National Prosecuting Authorities, very little, if any, access to forensic skills. You know, I've said this on many platforms. In my view, it takes around 10 years to produce a competent, effective, and importantly confident prosecutor, and it takes around 20 years to produce a confident, competent, and effective specialist prosecutor. And the requirement of confidence should never be underestimated, because when you're prosecuting these types of cases, your opponents are the very best that the bar has to offer. And so it's no good sending in a young, inexperienced prosecutor who lacks confidence and is overwhelmed by the wall of defense that will march into court every day, 2, 3, 4 silks, 5, 6, 7, 8 high-powered out attorneys all wearing suits, and they sit there all on their own. It's intimidating, and unless you have had the opportunity to develop your skills as a prosecutor, then you would not be human if you were not intimidated by that sight. And so what's happening now is that there are very few such prosecutors left in the National Prosecuting Authority. And so younger prosecutors who have all the potential in the world, I'm sure, but lack experience and confidence are faced with this kind of prosecution. And that is one of the reasons why these big matters are continuing to flounder. Having said that, prosecutors are not supermen, and they do not investigate cases off their own bat. So they need competent, effective, experienced, and confident investigating officers who are housed in the police at the moment to do the investigation. And the police have even less such experience available to investigate the matter. And so what you have is a not fully investigated complex corruption matters being dealt with by not fully confident and experienced prosecutors, and it leads to what we see, a disaster. So the bill envisages an institution that will house experienced, confident, competent prosecutors alongside confident, experienced, and confident investigators with all the forensic support skills that are required, including accounting forensics, including cyber forensics, and all of those issues that are required to make a large-scale corruption case bulletproof. And that will be housed in one institution. They will be able to interact with each other on an equal basis. Experience, knowledge, points of view can be exchanged in an effective and efficient working environment, which has happened before and was very effective. It happened initially. The forerunner of the Scorpions, or the Director of Special Operations, was the Office for Serious Economic Offences, which was known as OSIA. It was in its later iteration, it became the DSO, and it worked exceptionally well. And the reason for its demise was the fact that it worked exceptionally well. So its effectiveness, when it went after more particularly politicians, upset them, didn't like the bite, and they closed it down. And as Advocate Hoffman has already said, they closed it down with a simple majority, 50% plus one. Clearly, that muscle memory remains in both of these institutions, the Hawks and the NPA. And so they know that if you go after well-connected, powerful people, you lose your job. And so nobody tackles these kinds of cases with the kind of gusto that you would like to see, because they're aware all the time that a successful prosecution in that space may well be the end of your career. And so the easier thing is to continually kick for touch, continually ask for further investigation, continually find more things to charge with so that the matter is never court ready and court ripe. And so in that way, you can avoid the confrontation of the court, or you go to court with a case that is less than perfectly prepared, the results of which are always going to be disastrous. So we need something outside of the control of Parliament, outside of the control of politicians, and a Chapter 9 institution gives you exactly that. There's no political party in South Africa that's ever going to see again the kind of majority that will allow them 2/3 to close anything down. And so therein lies the security of tenure. They will have the freedom to go after whomsoever needs to be gone after with seriousness, with serious goal in mind, and have the comfort that they cannot lose their jobs because of doing a good job. That will encourage people who have the kind of experience and the kind of expertise that's required to accept a job in that kind of institution. At the moment, they don't want to accept a job in the National Prosecuting Authority or in the police because it leads to a dead-end street. And so it's very difficult to attract that kind of expertise because of the very obvious risks. Once you set up an institution that allows the freedom of independence, you will attract those people. And there are many of them in South Africa, believe me, employed elsewhere, in the public sector, in other departments, many of them, and I speak to them daily, who are dying to form part of an organization that allows them to put an end to this corruption that is killing this country. They're available, they're out there. Some of them have been retired. Some of them have been retired prematurely. Some of them have left because they're just so sick of it. They're dying to come back and make a contribution. They're still here. They're committed South Africans. They haven't left the country, and they all want to come back and make a difference. But they do not have the freedom to do that without security of tenure. So a Chapter 9 institution will negotiate its budget directly with the Treasury. It will not be subject to the largesse or lack thereof of the Department of Justice. And they will not be perennially underfunded in order to keep them below a level of competence that is acceptable, and they will be able to perform their job effectively and efficiently, which is what we all want to see. The reason that the second bill, of course, is just to amend the Constitution to allow for the creation of a further Chapter 9 institution. So those two bills run together. And the reason why the response has been less than overwhelming is, of course, because the people who are required to support it are also the people who will be in the firing line, and they're perfectly aware of that. And so there's a great reluctance to swap their seat in Parliament for a seat in prison. But we'll have to see how it goes, because this is a double-edged sword, and there are 2 elections coming up. And those parties who do not wish to support serious anti-corruption proposals that will make a serious dent against corruption and help put a stop to it and aid in getting all the stolen money back. Those parties who refuse to support that will have to face their electorate as being a party who does not support anti-corruption. And so it's a choice they'll have to make. Either way, they're going to pay a price. Individual members may find themselves in, in those rather fetching orange overalls, or political parties as a whole will have to pay the price for supporting corruption. Because let me tell you, South Africans, ordinary South Africans, are sick to the ears of corruption. They are sick of it. They know what it's doing to them. They know what the results of it are. They know that it's the main cause of the fact that they're unable to find jobs, that they're unable to support their families, that they're unable to put food on the table, that they're unable to educate their children, is corruption. That is the main cause, and there's no way around it. So they either support these bills and put an end to it, or they support a party that wants to continue with it. And I can tell you now that that's a choice that people are going to have to make.
Giving all of these powers in one body, one Chapter 9. I have seen Chapter 9 be captured and not perform their jobs ideally. What prevents that from happening with the Anti-Corruption Commission?
Sure, there is that risk, and it's a risk with any organization. It's not limited to Chapter 9s. Of course, the Chapter 9 institution is responsible to Parliament. You have to answer to Parliament. You have to report back. Parliament has oversight over how you conduct your work, how you conduct your budget. All of those things are the subject matter of oversight. And if that's done correctly, it should keep you relatively honest. We've seen what happened with the Office of the Public Protector, for instance, and eventually that Public Protector was impeached. It's a process that took a lot longer than was desirable, but it was an effective process, and it removed her. That is the check and balance in place for that kind of thing. But of course, when you're appointing somebody as the head of an anti-corruption commission, you want to be very careful about how you appoint them. So the appointment process needs to be, transparent. There needs to be public participation, much like we're hoping the amended appointment procedures of the National Director of Public Prosecutions will look. Public participation, public interviews, very transparent, and bearing in mind what the job is, a very careful consideration of who the incumbent should be. Nothing is bulletproof in life. You run that risk, but it's a very public position. And it's the public will watch it very carefully.
Add to that, if I may, in the last Glenister case, Glenister 3, there was a minority judgment by Justice Cameron in which he dealt with the criteria for appointments. If you are appointing in a properly constituted and set up anti-corruption commission, you will appoint in the manner that Justice Cameron suggested in his judgment in Glenister 3, and you won't run into the sorts of problems that you raise your eyebrows to.
It's actually quite serious what's happening, and I think not only because of the corruption that's going on, but I think there's a bad culture in South Africa, and I guess we can say the ANC government, of pushing for constitution and democracy that is, giving freedom, it's giving rights, it's like stands for justice, but clearly there's a culture to do the complete opposite. And even with what Advocate Glynnis is saying, is that the lack of budget to even hire competent investigators or hire competent forensic analysts or even hire competent people to stand and prosecute is completely ridiculous. And I think what's happening now is the lack of trust and lack of faith for South Africans, because not only is it allowing corruption to spread wild, it's trickling down in all other sectors of crime in South Africa. Because even if it's happening and this is not necessarily contained with corruption, it's clearly they're not contained in the murder cases, in the crime, in GBV, in all sectors of law, and that means justice is just not coming out. So I think it's quite interesting that an ANC that stands for freedom and justice, or ANC government, I'll say, that stands for freedom and justice, and South Africa has the best constitution in the world, are doing everything that is literally opposite to that those constitutional powers and making sure those constitutional principles are placed.
What is the process for our viewers who are not aware of how the parliamentary process works? What is the process going forward for what we can all see as a very important bill? So you introduced this bill back in November last year. So you introduced it on the 1st of November 2024. What is the process going forward?
Of course, it's been sent to the Justice Portfolio Committee for processing. We've had a discussion on it. It needs to go now for the public participation for the committee. So we'll have to hear from institutions and people, to come and present their views. The public participation to the gazetting of the legislation was overwhelmingly positive. People were really very, very, very supportive of these two pieces of legislation. And so it will have to be a balance in the end, and eventually it will come down to a parliamentary debate and we'll have to vote on it. If you then vote against it, you will be on public record forever and ever and ever as supporting corruption.
When do you expect the committee to open up this bill for public comment? And do you expect Parliament to vote on this bill? And as you said, show which parties are serious about tackling corruption and those which are not. When do you expect Parliament to vote on it? Will it happen before the 2026 local government elections?
It's unlikely to happen before the 2026 local government elections, but more importantly, it must happen before the 2029 national elections. The process for putting it out for public participation is in full swing.
And then lastly, you mentioned that when the notice of intention to introduce this 21st constitutional amendment bill was published for public comment, the overwhelming majority of comments were positive. So the public often thinks that, okay, only if I have something negative to say should I comment on a piece of legislation. What type of weight is given to positive comments in a committee's consideration? How does the committee debate work in taking into account what the public wants? Does it come down to a simple majority of what the public wants?
First and foremost, the job of any public representative is to represent the public. Public comment is very important when you weigh up any piece of legislation. And every single public rep, of course, has in the back of their mind the fact that if you go against what the public prefers, you can do that if it's necessary to do. And of course, in some instances, you must. But then, of course, you have to be able to explain it. You have to be able to go back to the electorate and say, this is why I've done what I've done. So I don't know how you would go back to the electorate and say, this is why I don't support anti-corruption. It's a hard sell to say I support corruption. South Africans know what's going on. They're not fools, they're savvy, they're struggling, they know they're struggling, they know why they're struggling, and they expect members of parliament, they expect government to do something about it.
Advocate Hoffman, Advocate Breytenbach, thank you so much for the time that you have given to us today for this very, very important topic. To our viewers, if you found this conversation valuable, please remember to like, subscribe, and leave a review. And share it with someone who cares about the future of our democracy. Thank you for listening.